better? Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. This meeting really was a grassroots approach. A number of people just wanted to get more involved in the decisions that are going to be made or are being made for the ICDIC or the tentatively selected plan. And so we went out and identified appropriate speakers, and we have a good turnout. I really love seeing all the people here. But this is a good opportunity to find out a lot of different perspectives on storm surge, Galveston Bay, along the coast, and what the plan is, what the current plan is, and what alternatives might be, what different ways that things can be done. And also to have a little bit more of an environmental perspective. You'll note on the agenda that we have a few environmental groups that will be speaking too. And so just move pretty quickly. We're going to have each speaker allow 15 minutes to speak, and then we're going to have, if we stay on agenda, then we'll have a chance to have a Q&A session at the very end. They will be passing out note cards. We'll take written questions, and then we'll use those at the end. Logistics, restrooms are straight back to the right. Water, drinking fountain back there also. I want to thank all the volunteers that helped pull this together. I want to thank the organizations. I want to thank Commissioner Adrian Garcia and his staff for helping us get this facility. I want to thank all the speakers. These are some really great leaders and people very knowledgeable about what we can do. And with that, I'm going to just say Kelly Burks-Copes from the Corps of Engineers and David Green are going to be the first two speakers. They're ready to go right now. And on the back of the agenda, just to save a little time, we have everybody's bio on the back side of the agenda. And following that, we'll have Jim Blackburn from the Speed Center, Bob Stokes from the Galveston Bay Foundation, Brant Manchin from the Sierra Club, Jordan Maka from the Bayou City Waterkeeper, and John Jacob from the Texas Community Watershed Program. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our two partners here, Kelly and David Green. Applause, please.
And thank you for inviting us. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much for coming.
I'm Dr. Kelly Burks-Copes. I'm the project manager for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Coastal Texas Protection and Restoration Study. On my left is our cost-share sponsor, Mr. David Green, from the Texas General Land Office, or GLO. I'll try not to use a lot of acronyms in my presentation. I'm going to give you a little update on where we stand, what the tentatively selected plan is, and where we're going with it. And then Mr. Green will step in whenever he wants, if you will. And hopefully we can do this. I talked very fast. I get that. I'm sorry about that. But I understand there's a lot of time at the end for questions, so we'll have a good conversation, I believe. And I have to point this at the machine now. So in 2016, under the Water Resources Development Act, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was authorized to study coastal storm risk management measures and ecosystem restoration in this region, but also up and down the coast. We were given both goals simultaneously, and we were asked to develop a series of objectives, which is what you can see behind me, and I'll have to look to read them for you. We're looking at reducing coastal storm risks and the risks to human health and safety. We're also asked to look at resilience in general, but also ecosystem restoration in combination with preservation of landforms and in connecting hydrologic features. The ultimate goal is ecosystem restoration of salt marshes and also critical habitats up and down the coast as well. The tentatively selected plan as presented here is what you will find out on our website as well as inside our document. It is a holistic approach to resilience. It starts in this region with the proposed coastal barrier system on the Bolivar Peninsula crossing the inlet into the bay and going down Galveston Island. It also includes 160,000 acres of ecosystem restoration, salt marshes, seagrasses, islands for birds, oyster reefs, and a great deal of erosion control, since that's one of the things that we're facing up and down the coast. There is a small coastal storm risk management feature proposed on South Padre Island as well. Those are really dark, and I apologize for the lighting. I wanted to tell you how we got here and give you just a little bit of the backstory. Several entities out there in the universe, which you will hear from soon in this panel, had already proposed features to help with reducing risks in this area. One of those features was a barrier system. We looked at not only a barrier system along the islands, but also stepping forward closer and closer to Houston with different types of barrier systems that would provide risk reduction. We also looked at an alternative where we would put a barrier system along the west-hand side of Galveston Bay, either along 146 or right along the rim. The ultimate tentatively selected plan includes is a barrier system that starts at High Island, crosses the GIWW or the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, goes onto Bolivar Peninsula, crosses at the navigation channel or the inlet into Galveston Bay with a series of gates, 2 large navigation gates and an additional 39 what we call environmental flow gates. It ties into the seawall with a ring barrier around Galveston with a pumping system so that when the barrier system is closed, we can still draw off water that comes in with the hurricanes. At the bottom of the seawall, it then connects and goes all the way down, but stops at the San Luis Pass, so basically at the end of Galveston Island. You'll also notice up in the left-hand corner, to my right, your left, a cross-hatched area. That's this area. We're talking about proposing gate structures at Clear Creek and at Dickinson with pumps so that when those gates are closed during the storm, we can still draw off the water that's coming down, and a series of non-structural measures, floodproofing and raisings in this area for those situations where we expect to see wind-driven surge in this region with the storm. Specifically in this region, we are proposing over 24,000 acres of marsh restoration and beach and dune restoration. Along the front of both of the peninsula and the island, as well as on the backside, this provides us with something called multiple lines of defense. It's a way of using natural and nature-based features to do risk reduction, but also to provide ecosystem restoration simultaneously, so kind of a dual-purpose structure. We didn't get here by fault. We actually looked pretty hard at what would happen if there wasn't a barrier in place. Now, if you take a look at NOAA's sea level rise viewer, and you dial the sea level rise up to approximately 3.5 feet, what you will see is a tipping point in this region, a point at which critical habitat starts switching into either open areas or different types of areas. That would then provide less risk reduction, would open the bay up to the Gulf, and would actually cause a fairly severe change in what we are seeing in the situation out there now. On top of that, we have used over 600 simulated hurricanes to look at, with sea level rise and a hurricane on top of that, what type of inundation we would see on the barrier islands, but also up in this area. As you can see on the left-hand side, it's a no-action situation. If there's no barrier in place, this is what we can expect with a storm that's similar to a category 3 to 4 situation. On the right-hand side is the proposed barrier of the tentatively selected plan, which would be along Bolivar Peninsula, closing off the inlet just during the storm, and then continuing down Galveston Island. Now, what you should notice on the left-hand side of that map is that there is still a bit of flooding with that barrier. So that's why we have the proposed structures that would allow us to kind of lift this area in those areas that we are expecting to see some inundation. I'm sorry, this is the map, and that's because my back is to it, so I'm apologizing again. This is the no action plan on the left, okay? And then on the right, the barriers in reduction in storm surge up in this area per se. But on the left-hand side, even with the barrier, you can see the green. So that's why we feel that there is still some need for non-structural measures and the gate closings at Clear Creek and Dickinson. The overall cost of the study is between $23 and $32 billion. You may have heard that that is the barrier alone. That is not true. 40% of that cost is ecosystem restoration. Remember that we're proposing to restore 160,000 acres, not only in this region, but all the way down the coast. The other remaining 60% is coastal storm risk management, both on Padre Island and here in this region. We do anticipate direct impacts as a result of this barrier placement. We have foreseen, as you can tell, about 4,500 acres of direct impact under the alignment, and also some impact at the coastal storm risk management barrier on South Padre. Part of the cost, part of the 60% of the cost, so part of the structural cost is mitigation, and we are anticipating between $600 and $900 million worth of mitigation will be required to not only offset the direct impacts, but the indirect impacts. We do anticipate indirect impacts with the current plan. The current plan does involve and include sector gates on the nav channel. Just think of fans that open up during normal times and are closed during the storm. Even during, when they're open, even during normal days, we do expect a constriction of flow into the bay, approximately 27% with the current design. We anticipate and intend to bring that constriction, that number down and have less constriction of flow into the bay. Hopefully then that will reduce our need to mitigate as much, but we will still be assessing that kind of mitigation. So this is really why I'm here. The path forward now. We have had 105 days of public comment period. It closed on February 8th. We are now taking in that information, digesting it, and formulating approaches and strategies to address those concerns and issues. We have already started evaluating moving the barriers that we have proposed on Bolivar Peninsula and Galveston. We're evaluating those in terms of moving them towards the front of the island, but not only that, changing the construct of them so that they would be potentially dunes and beaches instead of hard structures, as you oftentimes see with the barrier proposed plans. We're also exploring the utility and need for Clear Creek and for Dickinson. We need to know whether they're necessary and also how big and how much capacity we would need if we close those off during a storm. We have met with our cohorts on the panel tonight, Texas A&M and with Bryce, to talk about their proposed plans, to understand what the differences are, and to absorb and try and figure out what kinds of things we can take into our plan in addition to what they have done. We have, and GLO can speak to this if you want to stand up and speak to it really quick. We've got about 3 minutes.
So one of the big things we're trying to do is,
Oh, very cool.
so one of the things we're really trying to do is create community work groups where we can have better interaction directly with folks that are going to be affected by this plan, and to get better input from them on how this plan can work better for them and how it might affect them more positively and eliminate some of the negatives of the plan that they see. So what we've been doing is trying to form these groups in different areas along the state, including here, and move forward and have conversations as we move forward with the plan and move forward of getting it finalized in the next couple of years. So.
And you can ask more questions of David at the end, I believe. Also, I'm going to go back. We are hosting an international gate design workshop in a couple of weeks where we've invited folks from all over the world who've actually developed barriers of this type and size so that they can provide us key insights into how we might basically bring the constriction rate down. We'd like to see 10% or less. And so we're asking them to give us their lessons learned and their sage advice, and they're going to help us with redesigning those gates. We have proposed and are continuing to do additional additional storm modeling. Now that we are reconfiguring gates and barriers and types of barriers, we're running new and more models to see what the effects would be. We are also looking at what would happen if we only had the gates, or if we had gates and the barriers, or if we had the gates, the barriers, and the marine barrier. We're actually starting to look at pieces and parts with the intent of starting to answer that question of, do we need it all? Can we put it all in sequence so that we can reduce risks in a meaningful manner with the available funds that we're likely to see? We've been looking at evaluating the non-structural measures in this area in particular, what those might be, and start formulating designs for those, highlighting the areas that we feel need them. We've also been coordinating with the natural resource agencies. We do anticipate impacts, and we are trying to work closely with them so that we can use their information, their subject matter experts, to help us not only reduce the risks, but mitigate properly and appropriately. And the last thing that we've been working towards, and we are discussing with our upper command, is a second public comment period once we have the designs refined and we have the report in a more final format. We would have, again, a series, if our vertical command agrees and GLO can work with us as well, a series of, again, 7 public meetings up and down the coast where we would open the floor for comments and take those in. It would give us an opportunity to action the things that are coming out of the community working groups and inform the public as much as possible so that we are always trying to be more and more transparent and not a black box. So with that, I'm going to finish with the study state. I'm going the wrong way again. I don't know what it is with me, guys. I can't hit the button. It is very backwards and it's like being left-handed too. Can you move it? All right. So we're in the recommended plan. Okay. We're still targeting a release of the final report in 2021 in the late winter, early spring. And on the next slide, what you'll see is that I want to impress again that we are early in the process. It may seem like we're headed towards a final report, but the way this works is that you study it, and then you hand that to Congress, and Congress authorizes and appropriates money, and then you go into design and build and then operations. We have a cost-share sponsor for the study.
I just want to emphasize too what she was saying, that really the purpose of this point of the study was to look at the 5 larger concepts of potential solutions, and then try to find out, comparing it to what the core needs on their benefit cost ratio and their other analysis of what provides the most protection for the most people, the largest area, and then to move forward with studying that more in-depthly. So at this point of the study, all we were really doing was presenting these 5 different scenarios and saying that this, at this point of the study, was the preferred option, the draft option going forward, and then presenting that to the public for comments. We weren't really trying to get into the real details of the study on exactly what everything would look like. We're trying to get that public feedback right now so that we could optimize, improve the plan, and then go forward and make sure that we were doing the right thing. So now that we've had it out, had our public comment period, and completed that, again, we're analyzing it and then moving forward, and then the Corps will be presenting those public comments and everything that we've learned so far to their upper command so that we can move forward over the next 2 years and complete the study. And then from there, we would then move into engineering and design and all that based on having a recommended plan going forward. But again, we still have 2 years left in the study, and we still need to go through these processes that the Corps is required to do, and that we want to do to make sure that we have the right plan in place for everyone.
So I'm going to end with Watch This Space. We have a website up on the screen that you can watch as we evolve, as the design evolves. We are standing up the Facebook site as well, so that we will be posting new and interesting information as we go forward in the next 18 months. And with that, I will turn it over to the podium, and I apologize for the minute. It's a clicker thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out and speaking tonight, and it's great to have that information. I have to apologize. We are moving quickly. I used to do some events like this at NASA, and it's amazing how much more information you can get when you have a limited amount of time to do it. With that, I'd like to invite up here to the podium Jim Blackburn, there he is, who's going to talk about the Galveston Bay Park Plan, kind of the Mid-Bay Plan as I understand it. He's with the SPEED Center and Rice University, who's been involved in environmental activities for a long time. Yep.
We got a new plant. We have a new plant here. I think this might be a little better. I'm Jim Blackburn. I'm here tonight speaking on behalf of the SPEED Center, the Severe Storm Center at Rice University. And to jump right into it, I'm basically an advocate for the Bay. I have been my whole career. I wouldn't be here except for this map right here. This is a map that just horrifies me. This is a good, strong Category 3 storm that generates a surge. It comes in at the worst place, which is, let's see, where is your pointer? Not one, okay. Comes in right down here at San Luis Pass. Back, the circulation is in this way, and it's really the worst possible location for landfall. This is not an incredibly huge storm. Our methodology is a bit different than the Corps. We basically were picking what we thought were reasonable worst-case situations and analyzing them. That generates 25 feet of surge up the Houston Ship Channels, about 22 feet here in the Clear Lake area. It inundates a huge amount of area. It causes a tremendous amount of damage. What caught my attention is the fact that of 4,400 storage tanks on the Houston Ship Channel, this surge would inundate about 2,200 of those. We have analyzed that. Dr. Jamie Paget at Rice has, and she has assigned failure probabilities based on the type of tank, based on the location of the tanks, and the depth of inundation. And her assessment was we were looking at the likelihood of about 90 million gallons of oil and hazardous substances being spilled with a 24-foot surge. To put that in perspective, Deepwater Horizon was 210 million gallons. The Exxon Valdez was 10 million gallons. So it's a huge spill. In my opinion, that would wipe out Galveston Bay for decades. There's certainly going to be disagreement about that, but that's certainly my concern. We came up with an early solution we thought was great. Put a gate across the mouth of the ship channel and block the storm surge. Had minimal impact, very effective, except it did not protect the residential areas on the upper part of the coast. The west side of Galveston Bay was essentially unprotected by that. I made a number of public presentations down here. I have arrows all over my body from the response from the residents to that. Basically, it was a non-starter to protect the industry and not to protect the residential areas, which I understood. We have come up with an alternative of sorts. It can be done in combination with, it can be done independent of anything else that's being proposed here in the channel. But we call it the Galveston Bay Park Plan. And it basically has 6 elements. First, it is a dike structure that runs along the current disposal areas of the Houston Ship Channel, starting up here with the Atkinson Island area and coming down with a 25-foot wall that is constructed as part of the dredge disposal that is ongoing along the ship channel. The gate structure that would actually block the navigation channel whenever the storm comes would be up in the middle of the bay rather than down here. And then we would flip sides and come in and tie into the Texas City levee system down here, which is where number 2 is Texas City. We would recommend raising the Texas City dike, which is currently at, or Texas City levee, which is currently at 17 feet, to uniform 25 feet to match the structure in the bay. Number 3, we believe Galveston Island, or the city of Galveston, is going to need a backside levee. It is almost impossible to protect it from the front side because of back circulation coming back down the bay. Much of the flooding from Ike was from the backside and not from the front side. We think that elevated roads for evacuation would be highly recommended. We think beach nourishment with sand is recommended. And it's possible you could flip over and extend the Galveston backside levee to include portions of Pelican Island and the Port of Galveston. That would add up about at least another $500 million to the estimated cost here. The Sponsor right now is SPEED Center, Rice University. We don't know if anybody else is going to be interested in this or not. We're basically presenting this as an alternative. Our cost, $3 billion to $6 billion we estimate. We've shown our approach to the Corps. They kind of challenged our economic numbers. They would like to see a much more detailed study, which we would be more than happy to see done as well. But, you know, our analysis, our analytical process was not as rigorous as the Corps. We went through a different methodology than they did, but we feel good that it's in the probably no way. I would be surprised if it's more than $6 billion, but then these numbers have a way of rising. Timing, depending on how things were organized, this could be done actually relatively quickly. The potential for at least getting major structural pieces in place could be 2025, 2027 timetable, depending on how it was approached. And then I screwed up and my next two came up together. There could be multiple funding sources, the way that we're thinking about it. There the potential of various partners for different pieces. We do not see this as a single standalone project with 6 elements, but rather 6 elements that could be done by different proposers. We have multiple uses that are possible from here. We think flood protection, navigation, and recreation, as well as environmental enhancement, including beneficial use of dredge material and marsh creation. From the standpoint of environmental, we have done computer modeling. We know there's some out there that don't like any intervention in the bay. I understand it. I've been there. Again, it's one of those things that I think is what we need to have public discussion about and hear a lot of different points of view on. We have done computer modeling of the impact of this on bay circulation and salinity. We showed minimal impacts to both. Primarily because so much of the circulation comes up and down the ship channel, and the ship channel itself is unimpeded. Then the pass is unimpeded. But there will be impacts to the oyster reefs that will have to be mitigated. From what I understand, we should be able to create new oyster reefs, and I think that is very much something. There could be issues with marine mammals using the channel. Level of protection, 17 feet to 20 feet at the city of Galveston. We really think the seawall needs to be raised. Nobody wants to raise the seawall, but we think it's actually, frankly, imperative with the storms we're seeing. They're coming over the top of the seawall. We think that that's a very real risk. 25 feet back up into the bay. Benefits, particularly combining navigation and flood protection are probably the 2 key things. Protection-wise, this is what the results are for a 250-year storm, which is by old statistics. I'm not sure. I believe that that's a 250-year storm. But it's basically a strong Category 3 storm, FEMA Storm 36. And basically the area behind the ship channel structure is very well protected. The blue over here shows about 2 to 4 feet of increase, with relative sea level rise of about 3 to 4 feet by 2085, and the same FEMA Storm 36. You see about 6 to 8 feet behind the levee system with significant flooding elsewhere. That is with an elevated seawall. We think that the potential to combine this with navigation is a key element. There is a proposal right now to both deepen and potentially widen the ship channel. There will be dredge disposal going on. That activity will be undertaken, it appears, and this could be done in conjunction with that. Basically, it's the idea would be to bring two-way ship traffic into the channel for the larger vessels that are currently stuck with one-way traffic. In terms of phasing, you basically would do the dike in association with the expansion of the channel. You would come behind that with gate structures, and then with the beneficial use of dredge material coming in behind that. And in theory, we would have some type of gate like this is the Maasland Barrier in the Netherlands. This is the Seabrook Gate in New Orleans. The gate structures up here in the bay would be like the Seabrook Gate, and then that's the big navigation gate down at the bottom. So navigation gate here. These would be gates primarily for letting circulation occur and for providing access to recreational vehicles and to oystermen, shrimpers, fishermen. And that's where the gates are. Ultimately, there could be quite we think, a recreational destination here with the beneficial use. Right now, none of this is accessible. If you put this infrastructure in, you would have to have some form of access. We think bicycling, hiking, perhaps even camping would be possible. And right now, access to Galveston Bay is not very great for the people that don't live on the bay. I think many of you that live here know that. This could change that. Shared cost opportunities. This could be done with navigation money in association with flood protection money, perhaps. This could be done with highway money. There would be separate sources of funding for the backside levy at Galveston for the raising of the Texas City levy. Some of that could be done in association with the Corps of Engineers. Some of that could be done independently. And then basically the idea of the Oyster Reef expansion area here, the Trinity River is going to be seeing much less inflow over time. The water is being taken out of the Trinity primarily to the city of Houston in the form of the Lustids Bayou diversion, and we will see less and less inflow into Trinity Bay. That means basically that the salinity sweet spot for oysters is going to be migrating to the north up into Trinity Bay. That's where we would propose the oyster expansion. There's a possibility of joint funding for flood control and navigation under a special provision of the Water Resources Development Act that has never been used. There's a possibility of applying to the Corps of Engineers for a separate standalone permit to build the gate structures and the barriers. If this is going to happen, you have to form a large working partnership. You have to reach out to the various governmental entities that are involved, both local and at the state level. Possibly some of the folks that don't like what the Corps is doing might like this one. Others may not. We hope to reach out to the various environmental groups, and we hope to work with the citizens groups that are out there. We've had one group that has expressed support of the concept so far. I think the point being that there's a basis for consensus design here. We can work together, we can figure these out. I've never seen a situation that I thought deserved serious consideration of taking some environmental risks to the extent that the potential threat to particularly the Houston Ship Channel and to the residential areas on the west side of the bay poses. I think it's a bona fide national security issue, and it's certainly a regional and local security issue. And it's going to take all of us working with good faith and being real honest about things and trying to work it out to make this work. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. And next up is Bob Stokes, the president of the local Galveston Bay Foundation, right here in the Bay Area. Here you go.
Thanks, Doug. I'm going to take the same position that Jim took so I can see this thing moving forward. Yeah, great. So, I appreciate the opportunity, Doug. Thanks for putting this together. We've done a lot of talks about Ike Dike and coastal barrier. I think it is a really, really difficult public policy issue. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer at the moment, and so I appreciate the Corps' willingness to be transparent and to keep input with public comment, and so we will continue to provide that public comment. And we are tonight, Galveston Bay Foundation, going to talk about the tentatively selected plan. So that's the thing that they're putting forward now. It may change, but it may not. So that's the one alternative that we have some real concerns about, and we're going to walk through those a little bit. So just, I think hopefully some of you know who we are. We're a local nonprofit. Our office is over just past Johnson Space Center. Been around for about 31 years now. Mission is to preserve and protect Galveston Bay. And our concern here is about the impact of any structure to Galveston Bay. We all live here, we get it. I've lived in the Houston area for 24 years, I've been through storms, I know the issues here, but our mission is specifically about Galveston Bay. So the biggest concern that we have, and there are a lot of concerns, and there may be some folks here who live on Bolivar or Galveston, and there are significant concerns with the proposed levees across the middle of both those places. Even putting it on the beach, there's significant concerns. There's a lot of issues there, but I'm not going to focus on them tonight. I'm going to focus on this. So this is the floodgate that is proposed for, obviously not the floodgate itself, but it's a depiction of where it will be between the tip of Galveston Island and Bolivar. And so just for perspective, many of you probably know this, but that's 10,000 feet wide. So it's almost 2 miles wide. And that's a key component, potentially, it is a key component of the TSP, the tentatively selected plan. So this is sort of an engineering look at this. We're looking down on a bird's eye view. This is Galveston Island, the tip of Galveston over here. This is Bolivar. And so there's a series of things that are proposed to ultimately block storm flow when a hurricane comes. Lots of sort of different things. There's basically a small wall that's going to be constructed on both ends of the structure. It'll just be a vertical wall. And then there are these, they call them environmental gates, sluice gates, sort of up and down. I think Kelly said there'd be 39 of them, right? So, and then there's the big navigation gate. This is 1,200 feet wide. They would have to build 2 new islands in this area to house these structures that would then flood closed when a storm comes. And so our biggest concern is about all the infrastructure that is going to be in this pass permanently. So all those sluice gates, even though they'll be up, when the vast majority of the time are going to be anchored with concrete into the bay, these walls will be here. They're building 2 new islands. And so the concern, or the Corps has talked about it, and again, I applaud the Corps for having, still working on this and having this design gate symposium. And so, but right now, when this thing is wide open, day to day, it's going to restrict flow in and out of the bay by 27%. And so that's a pretty significant impact, we believe. So just some, again, depictions of this is the navigation gate. These things sit there and then float in and close. This is, what's wrong with that? Who did that before? Yeah, who did that before, right? Everybody's seen the pictures of the gate in the Netherlands. It's on a river system there as opposed to a pass, which currently is 60 feet deep, and I think the Port of Houston may want it to be 75 or 100 feet deep. So there's a lot of real major force at Bolivar Roads. And so these are the environmental gates that I talked about. Again, open. These gates are open right here. But this is a normal tide coming in and out. You can see the increased velocity of the water as it kind of goes through these environmental gates, because it's sort of like a garden hose. When a garden hose is on and it's open, the water comes out, you start to restrict it, and the flow decreases, the pressure increases, and the speed increases. And so that's what's going on right here. So as part of the TSP, the tentatively selected plan, there was a draft environmental impact statement. And we had some concerns. We, like maybe many of you, submitted public comments. We put some material on our website to help people put together some comments. But we submitted comments on a whole bunch of different things. And Scott Jones works with me at the Galveston Bay Foundation. He's really the expert. I'm not sure why he's not speaking about it, but Scott's the guy who put a lot of time and effort into this. So some of this stuff is pretty straightforward. We didn't believe that in the draft environmental impact statement that they had adequately analyzed the impacts of water quality to bay critters and animals, including critical commercial and recreational fishery species. How many people in here are fishing? We have some fishermen in the audience, right? So many of us fish, right? So I'll talk about that in a minute. The uncertainty, we feel like, maybe this is not fair, but it seems to be a little bit of a moving target. But hey, this is the TSP, but we might go this way, and maybe we'll go this way. And so hopefully if they do go this way or this way, we'll also get a chance to submit additional public comments. Cost-benefit analysis based on a TSP that will likely change, and they'll have to update that. Inadequate development, assessment of nature-based, non-structural solutions. no study of alternatives, basically different formats, and maybe that's one of the issues too, is and I'll get to this too, but just, there's not a real analysis of the environmental impacts of this thing. There's a list of potential issues, but they haven't really factored in a different analysis of environmental impacts of the different potential options. And then, Jim's presentation, which I really appreciate, I've heard many times, that particular mid-bay concept wasn't even analyzed in the draft environmental impact statement. So again, why do we care about this? And we hear over and over, we'll learn from the Dutch. We'll learn from the Dutch. Well, the Dutch have learned, and they wouldn't do some of the things that they did in the past. Again, part of what they've done is they've changed the hydrology in many other places. They've turned estuarine systems into freshwater systems. There's definitely potential significant concerns here. So I've already talked about the constriction of the pass. So when you constrict the pass, Galveston Bay is amazingly healthy, right? It's a place we love, we recreate, we catch fish, we swim. There's a lot of reasons for that. Despite all the pressure on it, we have a pretty good flow of water through the system. And so when you constrict the water by placing a barrier at the bottom of it, it slows the water down, right? So it doesn't flow in and out of the bay as much. So the tidal range will decrease. So we don't have a really big tidal range in Galveston Bay in the first place. It's like 18 inches. Well, it's going to decrease by 22% because less water will come into the bay when the tide is coming in, and less water will leave when the tide is leaving. The tidal prism will decrease as well. That's just the volume of the water. It won't decrease 22% because it speeds up, right? When you have that restriction, flow velocity potentially at the gates is going to increase by 6.6 feet per second. So that water that's coming into the bay from the Gulf is going to really speed up. You're going to see increased erosion around the edges of the bay because when the water slows down in the interior of the bay, the sediment drops out. And that sediment could be destined for a shoreline, but instead it's going to drop out in the middle of the bay. And so both the Gulf shoreline and the bay shoreline will have those problems. So water residence time, again, I reference this, like the water circulates through Galveston Bay, despite all the impacts, pretty good water quality through Galveston Bay. When you slow it down, it sort of makes it a little bit more like a bathtub. And not so good things can happen when that happens. You start to have algae blooms. You don't get the circulation, so you don't get the water coming in and out. Salinities are altered. This one takes a second to wrap your head around it, but the salinities will be higher in times of drought, right? So not enough water coming in and out of the bay, but when we have floods, salinities will be lower, right? So all that storm water will sort of be stuck in the bay, so salinities will be lower for longer period of time. I already referenced it, the sediment delivery shift from the bay margins to the middle of the bay. That's not good for the Port of Houston either, by the way. The Port of Houston spends millions and millions of dollars dredging out the ship channel every year with maintenance dredging. When more sediment falls into the ship channel, there's more cost there. And then this is fairly straightforward as well. The intertidal area will decrease. So the intertidal area is basically the difference between the high tide level and the low tide level. Well, if that high tide and low tide shrink, there's less intertidal range, which means that some wetlands on the high end and some wetlands on the low end are not going to be wetlands anymore. They're going to die. So, and then here's sort of, I think maybe this is the hardest issue. I think it's the hardest to study, the hardest to get any real answers on. We have all these fish, shrimp, and crabs who spend some portion of their life cycle out in the Gulf and some portion of their life cycle out in the Gulf. I've got a picture, right? So, it just depends on the species, but generally the adults are out in the Gulf, they spawn, the eggs and the larval and post-larval float back into the bay, the juveniles hide in the wetlands, they grow up, and then they go out to the Gulf and spawn again. So all these critters, literally 90% of what you see in Galveston Bay, fish, shrimp, crabs, spend some portion of the life cycle in Galveston Bay, some portion in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, what happens when you decrease the flow? Fewer of those critters get in and out, and fewer of those critters spawn. What happens when you increase the speed? They're on a big ride, an extra 6 feet per second. What does that do to the larval and post-larval critters? And what happens when you increase the pressure? And there's a lot of science that needs to come out of this, and we need answers on what it's going to do to the critters in Galveston Bay. I'm almost done, so I'll just sort of go through this quickly, but the draft environmental impact statement does mention this stuff, but it doesn't analyze it. So it says, It may affect wetland functions, could potentially impact the ecology of Galveston Bay with fish and birds and wildlife, could have long-term impacts on estuarine habitats and fauna, could impede the migrations and movements. But they sort of punted this in, could, but we haven't analyzed it yet. We're not going to analyze it until the final environmental impact statement. And so again, our position is let's make informed decisions here, right? It might be the final decision to do all this stuff, but let's know about it ahead of time. Let's really understand the good, the bad, and the ugly about this, and don't make any final decisions on this thing until you really know the impacts. So that's sort of the Galveston Bay Foundation's position, and I look forward to answering questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And I would like to ask you if you have any questions. We passed out some note cards earlier. If you would, at this point, go ahead and pass those through the center. We'll do this again when we wrap up before we do some Q&A. But I appreciate the comments, and it did remind me a little bit of what kind of drove us to do a flood forum back in November of 2017. And that was after Harvey, and everybody kind of realized that we hadn't done everything quite the way it should have been done with some of our reservoirs and how we managed them, and how we as public were engaged to help make sure the right decisions were made. And so that's what started that first flood forum, and that's why we're here tonight. Next up is Brant Manchin, who is actually the chair of the Houston area, the Houston group of the Sierra Club, and he's going to talk about why Coastal Texas Plan must change. Here you go.
Thank you, Doug. Before I get started, I want to also announce that a week from today, March the 14th, at 7:30 p.m. in St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Houston, there's going to be a panel discussion about storm surge, and I want to encourage y'all to come. And if you want to find out more about that, come up afterwards and talk to me, and I'll give you more information. And my name is Brant Manchin. I am a volunteer for the Houston Sierra Club, and just recently I became chair of the Houston Sierra Club. I think this particular quote is really important when we're talking about a coastal barrier, and the words in particular I want to emphasize: Barrier Island dynamic feature. It's got to be allowed to move and change shape because it needs to adjust to energy and sediment. And if you interfere with this, these natural processes threaten the integrity and maintenance of the Barrier Island system. And this is what we're talking about when we want to put 70 miles of flood walls, of levees, and existing seawalls and try and tie down Bolivar Peninsula and Galveston Island. We're not allowing the island to move as it's supposed to and as it must to stay above sea level as sea level rises. So I'm not going to go through this because really the Corps has gone through this, and so there's no point in me doing it. And basically this too. So what does IDIC do? Basically what IDIC does is it reduces storm surge 50%. And what that means is if you have a 30-foot storm surge at IDIC on Galveston Island, then approximately you'll have a 15-foot storm surge in Galveston Bay, because you do not get rid of storm surge entirely, even with 18 to 21 foot IDIC barrier. So what does an IDIC do? And I want to focus on a couple things. Ebb tide flooding, maybe a measure you haven't heard of before. So you have storm surge, which goes across Galveston Bay. The wind is pushing on at 150 miles an hour, pushed up to the ship channel and northern part of Galveston Bay, and then what? Well, the hurricane moves on, right? And then what happens to all that water that's pushed up? It comes flowing back down, and that's ebb tide, floods, and we really don't know yet what sort of impacts those will have with high tide, at least not from the environmental impact statement. It doesn't prevent sea level rise. Sea level rise happens no matter what. And the predictions for sea level rise keep increasing. By the end of 2100, depending on who you're looking at, 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, and some even say 10 feet of sea level rise. Ike isn't going to stop that. Rainfall flooding. We saw with Ike, we had a storm surge hurricane, and with Harvey, we had a rainfall hurricane. And Ike does nothing to prevent the impacts of a rainfall hurricane. There are other things, talking about barrier islands. Hurricanes actually keep barrier islands moving, and they actually create the back bay marshes that eventually become the dunes as the island moves. So if you block hurricanes and there's washover areas, you're not going to get the movement of the island. And I'm not going to go over the rest of these, but there's a lot of things Ike doesn't do. So Houston Sierra Club has an alternative. We call it the double E, economically and environmentally sound storm surge alternative. There's 3 handouts in the back. One is that particular alternative. Another is a resolution from 2009 when all of this that we're talking about was referred to more as shoreline erosion problems. But it has some good wordage in it. And I have 5 minutes left. And then the third one has to do with a bibliography on important coastal books that, if you're really interested, you might look at. So what are the additional solutions? From the Sierra Club perspective, we need for the industry to start taking responsibility for itself. Rice University and U of H have looked at the ship channel, and if indeed we've got the potential for a 90 million gallon spill, then those companies are responsible for that. And some of those particular storage tanks need to either be removed, elevated, tied down, strengthened, or maybe you change out tetramethyl for something less deadly. Also, long-term planning to take into account climate change, because the Corps' planning is now 50 years. But most of the increase in sea level rise is going to happen after that 50 years. So we really need to plan ahead. We need lots of buyouts, lots of planned withdrawal for people who've decided that it's time to leave. And I just want to mention again, Houston Ship Channel Industries need to step up and pay their share for whatever it is we're talking about. So what do we want to do? The EIS is not adequate. We want a brand new one, and we want another chance at public involvement. We also want a really extensive public outreach, and not what we have today, which is you walk in the room, there's some tables, there's some displays, and ultimately the Corps gives you a piece of paper and says, tell us what you think. We want real detailed discussions with people on the Bay as well as people in Houston and other places, because we're going to pay for it and we need to get everybody's thoughts and ideas. Local communities must have accurate and detailed information in these discussions. And remember, state of Texas and United States citizens and taxpayers, they're paying for it. So in some way, we need to let them know too. And finally, we need some alternatives. focus on non-structural solutions with structural solutions that lower environmental impacts. We really need to address Hurricane Harvey rainfall and floodplain flooding. And again, the Houston Ship Channel industries need to protect their facilities so they don't impact us. And that's who you mail your comments to. And thank you very much. And there's my phone number and my email. If you want to contact me, be happy to have you do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Okay, we're going to switch a little bit on the agenda. Originally, we were going to have Jordan Maka speak next, but instead, we're going to have John Jacob talk, and he's going to describe the dike breaks. He's from Texas A&M, the Texas Community Watershed Program. You see him involved in a lot of wetlands activities all about the Bay Area. Here you go, John.
Is reverse. I've been going in reverse for quite a long time here. All right, so my name is John Jacob. I'm with the Texas A&M University System with the Extension Service. The opinions expressed here are my own. I do not represent the university here today, but I'm part of that system, and we've been working on a lot of mitigation issues the last several years. So I've labeled my presentation today, the dike breaks. So I'm not necessarily saying dike's going to break, but I'm just saying that we need to think about the possibilities of a breach or a fracture and what that would mean. Because humanity has had a long and, let's just say, tempestuous relationship with levees and big dikes, right? We seem to really put a lot of stock in them. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is really comparing and contrasting structural versus non-structural ways to deal with the risks that we must face. So I'm not necessarily saying now don't build the dike. I'm just saying build it with your eyes open. And that's really how we operate in the Extension Service here. We don't tell people you need to do this or that. We just want to make sure that you are aware of all the implications that might be associated with it. So as I said, we've had a long relationship, even here in Houston, with these storm kinds of levees and dikes. This is long ago, maybe one of our first big storm projects. This is Addicts Reservoir here, I believe. And here's Buffalo Bayou. And you can see there's a little bit, this is still the natural channel here, a rather wide floodplain. But as they built this reservoir here, you can see that they imagined that that channel could be quite a bit, you could really build up quite a bit closer to the channel. In other words, at the area where the water flowed, they considered, because they're putting the reservoir in, that they could just go ahead and open up. So we got the structural and non-structural issues here. And then they said, well, you can, let's see where this goes. There we go. So here's, what would this be, 70 years, 50 plus years later. Here's the reservoir. This actually happens to be right during Harvey. And here's this channel here. And you can see that there are houses built right up next to the levee. So they left nary a buffer, because when you built that great big dam, that great big reservoir, well, you're not building it to fail, right? You're building it to protect. And so people then feel confident that this system is going to hold and they can build right up close to it. And you can see that, in fact, that wasn't the thing that they should have done. There should have been a buffer left in place there. And in fact, if you overlay on Google Earth the floodplain, you can see that the 100-year floodplain is just this little narrow thing. Here's the floodway. And so even all the folks that live here anywhere that's either brown or no color, you don't have to have flood insurance. You just don't have to worry about it. Or so they thought. But we learned, of course, that there was plenty to worry about. And then this is a recent data layer I got from the flood control district, Harris County Flood Control District. And
And you can see that even everything that was 500 years floodplain was inundated. Now, the levee did not break, right? The dam did not break here. This is not a failure. They're worried about a failure here, so they opened up those spigots a little more. But this is not a failure. So if there were a failure, well, there would be hell to pay without a doubt here. So the problem is, again, that here we put in these structural areas. Let's say we could have put them in for sure. Why couldn't we have left a larger buffer, just in case? Okay, just in case. So it's this idea of having buffers for safety is critical as we think about how we live here on the coast. And we've done this in many places. You might recognize this. This is Sugar Land. Here's all of these levee improvement districts, LID, coming and going. You might remember during Harvey, the county judge would be talking about 57, 58, right? They were talking about the height of that levee. Because if water were to breach, were to overtop, again, there would be hell to pay, without a doubt. And so you can see, in fact, Bob was talking about that Venturi effect over here, right? When you get a little bit of constriction. And here we have, this is the Brazos River, a big, fat river in flood that needs to spread out, and here we've constricted it. So again, we have these ideas that the levees will protect us, there won't be any problems. I would suspect that a lot of people don't sleep quite so soundly as they might have before Harvey. So this is just a close-up. This is the flood map from FEMA. These are areas that you see in these kind of places. It recognizes that there was a risk there. So this hatched area is floodplain. It recognizes a floodplain protected by a levee. Okay? So again, the issue is, do you want to put all your eggs in this basket and assume that the levee is going to hold? So we have a name for this. We call it induced development, right? In other words, if those levees had not been built, nobody would have built in the Brazos bottom, right? And you'd have to be certified to do something like that, right? We wouldn't do that. But once the levee goes up, well then okay, now it's safe. Now I can build there, no problem. We have another name for this. It's called the moral hazard, okay? Now, moral hazard, we face moral hazard all the time. It's something actually we have to live with. This is the official definition of a moral hazard. Is the lack of incentive to guard against risk where one is protected from its consequences. For example, by insurance. Okay? We all need insurance. If we didn't have insurance, well, we'd probably be driving old cars, or maybe we wouldn't be driving at all. But that kind of insurance is actuarial. Floodplain insurance is not. So again, there's a lack of incentive to guard against risk. You just come down in here, you don't buy flood insurance anymore, you're in. What's incredible about Sugar Land is there's just so much other land that they could be building on. And they select a floodplain of a big river and decide that we're going to put buildings of a development down here. So this is the same issue that we face here with the Ike Dike or other kinds of levee systems. If you build it, they will come. So this is a topographic map here of the lower Galveston Bay. I don't know if you can't quite see the contours here, but we're talking 2, 5 feet, 10 feet, something like that. Not a good place to develop. Right? And most people recognize it. If there's some development coming in, here's the diversionary canal up here. You can kind of see there's some folks kind of wanting to come down here. When a big levee is put there on Galveston Island, then we can predict, because we've seen this time and time again, that people will come. There will be induced development, right? And so then the problem that we have to think about is, if that's going to happen, if that could happen, and I believe me, it could and will happen, what do we do about it? Now, I did notice when I read through the Corps' report there that the induced development was actually mentioned. Not much more than that, but it was mentioned, so we applaud We applaud that for sure. But to me, this is a critical area that we need to think about, because we could be making people less safe than they otherwise would be. So yes, there's big issues here that we face, big Woodward County, as Jim talked about. But if we build this kind of a system, it could be worse. It could be much worse, because there would be a lot more people in harm's way. So failure is just, it plagues levees, it plagues human-built areas. What we need to know is, could it fail? And we need to know, well, what are the probabilities? I don't know that I've seen, maybe perhaps it isn't there, but what's the probability of failure? What kinds of failures could we be looking at with our system here, right? Not with the Dutch, but with our particular kind of geology and geoquality. Could you put on that? Little call out to our Dutch friends here. If it fails, Hans Brinker's thumb ain't gonna fix it, right? We're just gonna need a little more than that. So we need that kind of analysis, right? What is it we're looking at? These things have been studied. You can go in the literature, right and left. I'm already out of time here, so these kind of things are out there. Again, as Bob was saying, we need to go into this with our eyes wide open. What are the probabilities, right? Could it fail? How could it fail? Let's have an analysis of that. Now, I'm often sort of told, if I bring these kind of things up, well, we can't just have a do method, right? What are the alternatives here? Well, there are alternatives. There's no doubt about it. This is a UTMB on Galveston Island. Now, they did a very interesting thing after Ike. You might remember, they really suffered quite a bit from Ike. They went in, they put $1 billion into their facilities. I went to a conference where they showed what they did, and it's a wonder to behold. They are a hardened structure. They could take another Ike. So I asked them at that conference, I said, well, had the Ike dike been in place, would you have done what you did? Well, it took them 3 times, because they thought I was asking them if they believed in the Ike dike or not. And they wanted me to assure me that they were all in favor of the Ike dike. I said, no, that's not the question. The question is, would you have done what you did? And then once they finally came to it, the answer was a categorical, no, we would not. We would not have hardened our structure. So this is the moral hazard. Now, we can talk and debate about what might be better or might be worse. Should we put all our eggs in one big levee, right, that we can manage, hopefully? Or should we assume that people like UTMB and the petrochemical industry, that they can harden their structures sufficiently? And that's the kind of question, that's the kind of debate that we need to have. So are there alternatives? Absolutely. Industry, there's quite a bit of literature on these kinds of things. And in fact, yep, there's your very same Jamie Padgett that you mentioned there, who did a great analysis of what these tank farms, what these petrochemical plants could do. Now, there might be some questions as well. Maybe that's more expensive, maybe it's not. But that needs to be an explicit part, in my opinion, an explicit part of the kind of analysis that we need to take, should we decide to go forward with that. So again, in the end, it's about structural versus non-structural. For planners, the consensus idea is that non-structural is better than structural, for the reasons that we have talked about, for the potential failure, for the moral hazard, for these kinds of things. We may choose to go with that structural alternative. But these natural systems, the non-structural systems have worked for a long time and worked well, and we just have to decide if we are going to put all of our eggs in one basket here, because things might not come together quite so well as they were originally. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Okay, we're already to our last speaker. It's Jordan Maka, who's with she's Executive Director for the Bayou City Watershed. And she's going to talk about safe solutions, working with nature. And she's going to continue this kind of enriching of the discussion here. And then after that, we will have a quick panel discussion for as long as we have time for. We have some good questions here. I think most of them are probably directed at Kelly, the Corps of Engineers, as well as Jim Blackburn. But I find, I'm sure that those will be interesting. So we'll be up on that next after Corbin.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Really appreciate seeing the great interest in this topic, especially after we've had the public comment period from the Corps. And it's really critical that we, the citizens of Houston, Galveston, those living along the bay, continue to have interest in this project and continue to provide input into what this project is going to look like and what it's going to mean for our communities. So just a little bit of background. Bayou City Waterkeeper, we're formerly Galveston Bay Keeper. We changed our name in 2017. We have been around since 2001, and our mission is to protect the bayous, rivers, and streams that flow throughout the lower Galveston Bay watershed. And we do that through advocacy, law, and education with a commitment to science to make our waters fishable, swimmable, and drinkable. So this project, this proposal for the Ike Dike Coastal Spine Coastal Barrier System has been on our radar since Hurricane Ike, and it's something that we have, and I have been following since its inception. And so we're thankful to the Corps for being here tonight and providing some additional information as to the path moving forward. But we have concerns, like the other groups that have spoken here tonight, on what this is going to mean for our communities over the immediate term, the midterm, and certainly the long term, on what the impacts are going to be to the Bay, to our communities, and also to the economic framework and to the communities that we have here throughout this region. So we've had a lot of really great background from everyone who spoke before me, so y'all are lucky I'm going to be able to go by quickly so we can get to the question panels. But I want to talk a little bit more and expand on what John was able to explain a little bit before I talked on this concept of working with nature. Groups that I listed out here, as well as a few others that have joined the fray, have really tried to think about solutions and alternatives that can be economically and environmentally sound for storm surge alternatives in our region. We're thinking outside the box of what is traditionally done by what is considered by the Army Corps. Engineers love engineered hard structures, and we would really like to see more of a nature-based proposals and solutions being implemented into this plan. What we saw in the draft EIS was that while they were mentioned, and we appreciated that some environmental resources were considered and placed into the overarching feasibility study, but we would like to really see the EIS focus on an alternative that pretty much solely focuses on nature-based solutions as an alternative on its own. So part in that is utilizing nature-based flood protection models to protect our bayside and our coastal communities. So here I've kind of given a little bit of a model to show kind of what a multi lines of defense model could look like. And it definitely prioritizes nature-based solutions, but it does implement those non-structural and engineered structures as well to provide overarching protection for our communities. So with a focus on looking at our barrier islands, how can we strengthen those and protect them through preserving the land that is open now, that is undeveloped, protecting our wetlands, enhancing those areas that provide that natural storm protection and barrier, investing in living shorelines that both can be on the Gulf side, but here on the Bay side, for those that are living in the Clear Lake, Seabrook, League City, Kemah area, those could be inside the Bay by investing in oyster reefs and other methodologies that really help slow down water when it's coming over the Bay. And that's, we can build a structure across Galveston Bay, across Bolivar Peninsula, across Bolivar Roads, but we still have an open, Galveston Bay is a huge body of water that the hurricane's not going to stop once it hits that 17 to 21 foot wall. And so we need to be able to find ways that we can slow down that water once it gets to the Bay, regardless if we have a hard structure at the front of the Bay or not. So flood walls, levees, flood, and surge gates are not a silver bullet, and they're certainly not enough. John just gave a really good overview of kind of the moral hazard of flood walls and floodgates. We actually used the same picture unknowingly about how floodgates can break and overflow. I mean, that's a real possibility. And Brent gave a good example of climate change being a real concern that we need to look for the long term. The plan that the Corps has presented to us is meant to provide protection up to 2085, and we know that that's around a 50-year protection once that it's completed and built, but we're going to need protection past that point. And what are the types of protections that we can provide that will give us adaptive solutions that will continue to strengthen our natural resources, but also provide protection for our communities in the near term because it's less expensive to build, and for the long term as we're continuing to build and protect our natural protections. I'm a Houston native, but I worked in Louisiana for over 10 years, and after, especially around post-Katrina initiatives, and what we found in Louisiana, they definitely implemented a lot of these types of systems, but what we saw is that communities struggled to pay for these structures once they were built. And that is a real concern that everyone here in this room and beyond needs to really consider, that the Corps will provide the funding to build this, but it's up to us and our tax base to pay for that operation and maintenance costs, which can be in the tens of millions of dollars annually. And so are we ready for that commitment? Are we ready for that commitment of funding when I think there's still significant questions from this environmental impact statement that still need to be answered so we understand the overarching impacts that we're going to place on our communities as well as the resources in the Bay. So we talked a little bit about this as well, about industry must be held accountable to provide significant storm surge and flood safeguards for their own facilities. This is not necessarily on the Corps to provide that analysis for us. I do think, as John mentioned, that it is a part of the analysis to say if we had the oil and gas petrochemical corridor protecting themselves, what would that look like and how would that affect the overall cost-benefit analysis? But it's also on us as community members to talk to our elected officials, talk to our decision makers in our communities about what that would mean for industry to pay their fair share. The folks that have built long time along the petrochemical corridor have really received the greatest benefit of building on the ship channel, having access to these waterways, having access to be able to do their business with our natural resources. And our question is, what do they pay to make sure that to continue to reap the best benefits? So how are they paying us back from the community? Should a storm come? Should a major petrochemical spill happen in the Bay? Jim gave a really good example. I mean, the diagram that he showed at the beginning of his presentation really demonstrates there is significant harm that can happen if industry floods, if those petrochemical facilities spill into the Bay and into our communities. So our argument is a triple bottom line enhances and protects communities from our bayous all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. By protecting our communities, by enhancing our natural resources, and protecting and rebuilding and restoring these natural protections that we've had in place for a long time are significantly important. And I think too, for those of y'all that are living here in the Clear Lake, kind of western side of Galveston Bay, it's important to recognize that even with the Army Corps' models, you are still going to flood even with a 100-year storm surge. Now, in the EIS plan, feasibility study that's presented today, there is some measures in place for non-structural, which could be to elevate, it could be to provide buyouts if particularly vulnerable areas need to be taken out of places of harm. But in the EIS, we really would like to see more detail about what that's going to entail. And our argument from the beginning has been, while we appreciate this initial study, as Bob brought up from Galveston Bay Foundation, we need to be able to have a much more comprehensive idea of what the impacts are going to be, at least a better idea of what the design is going to look like, so that the public, those of us that are going to be impacted by the design, going to benefit from the design, and inevitably going to be paying for the operation and maintenance of this project, we have a full understanding of what it's going to mean so that we can make the best decision and provide the best input on how this is going to affect our communities and what we would like to see. So I'm going to divert a little bit to talk about a map that we put together, myself as well as an organization called Healthy Golf that's based in Louisiana but works golf-wide. And this is a resource that I encourage y'all to look at. It provides an opportunity to go and see the lines on the map that were provided, that are being presented by the Corps today. I know that we've heard a lot of times that this is just a line on a map, that these are at 10% design, but when we requested a Freedom of Information Act on this plan, these were the GIS files that were given to us by the Corps that is being utilized in the maps that they are using today. So we can see. So this is just an up-close version. It operates just like Google Maps does, so you can go and type in your address, and you can zoom in on the area to see where the structure, as we've seen from the Corps' own files, where the coastal barrier system is going to be. Again, I recognize the Corps has indicated it's going to be just a line on the map, but to date, these are the lines on the map that have been provided to us from the Corps themselves. And so it gives us just that first indication to be able to take ownership of what this project is going to look like and see where the project may be placed and how that's going to impact your community. So you can go to this link, see where it's going to be. In this area, it's all non-structural, so you kind of can see where that non-structural is being proposed in this area. So to cap it off, how can you continue to participate in this process? We've had the final and formal comment period that was offered by the Corps for the EIS, and it is the only one that is legally required in this process. And so it's really important for us, if you, regardless of where you stand on this project, if you support it as it is, if you don't support it, for us to just have a better fundamental understanding of what this project is going to look like, because we will be paying for it for our lifetimes. So requesting a secondary comprehensive environmental impact statement and EIS from the Army Corps and the General Land Office. And not just one whenever, soon after we get the comments on this most recent draft EIS, but one where after we've done and have the ability for the Corps to do the scientific analyses to provide a lot more comprehensive detail about what the project is going to look like from a design standpoint and placement, but also from the scientific and environmental impacts that still needs analyses. Contacting your local and state federal officials and decision makers. This is really critical. We're not in a period of a formal comment period anymore. And so this is the opportunity to really reach out to those who are going to be making those financial decisions after the Corps of Engineers finalizes this plan. It's going to have to be appropriated by Congress. And so that means it's going to have to be shepherded in by our officials here in Texas to get funding. And finally, discuss this with your friends, families, and neighbors and stay informed. This project and the design has changed shape so many times since 2009. And it's really important that we stay up to date and stay informed on what this is looking like today. And so, appreciate all of you coming out today. And I guess we're going to move on to questions, hopefully.
Thank you, Jordan. And I'd like to ask the speakers to come up here and maybe sit on this side. Hopefully there'll be enough chairs. So we'll take about 15 minutes for this or so, and I think we got a lot of good questions. And so I hope you can stick around and learn a little bit more. I think we've had a lot of great information tonight, and we have about 15 more minutes to get a little bit more.
Need one more chair?
Okay, Grant's over there. Poor Brown. All right, are we ready? Grant, are you ready? Yes. Okay, the first question is, it has been a long time since what can you recommend to reduce the time to build these proposals? And I guess that will go right down this line right here.
Okay. I'm gonna give it to you first.
Right, so, so again, this is just the feasibility portion of the study to see if there is a project that would fit into the course process of making a recommendation from the head of the Corps to Congress for potentially funding engineering and design later. So at this point, it's really just looking into the feasibility of the study. But what was great about the study as well is that Governor Perry at the time created what was called the GCC PRD, which was another group that met here about 2.5 years ago and made a recommendation. It was a 6 county judges from the area, from Brazoria County up to Jefferson County. And they made a very similar recommendation and are still working on that study as well. And we've taken all that information. I think that actually really helped us speed up the process of this study into getting it into where we are right now. And I think that actually helped. The problem is on a study that's this complex and affects so many things that we've discussed today, there's really not a good way to get it sped up any faster. It affects so many people, it's so much money that we're talking about, there's really not a good solution for this giant project like this. On the other side though is, we've talked about this and these natural solutions that we can put into place, and that's what we're advocating for, and the Corps is working on as well, is getting better beaches in place, rebuilding our beaches that we're losing, better protecting our dune systems, protecting our marsh systems, acquiring properties so that we can have better access to things and let people interact with nature and everything, but also have these natural protections that are in place at the same time. And I know and with Galveston Bay Foundation, we have a great partnership with them and other organizations like that that can help us put these things in place, and there's a lot of funding that we actually have an opportunity to use right now to help put those things in place to protect us on maybe a smaller scale, but they do still provide neighborhoods and homes and businesses protection, but just not on this large scale that affects so many people and that take a long time to get put in place. So
I want to do one more thing first. And the Corps of Engineers right now is moving into the second phase of the study. Part of that I mentioned earlier is sequencing. The idea that we don't build it all at once, that we break it up into more manageable parts. We assess what would produce the most risk reduction, what would produce the most environmental benefits, focus on those and set those up as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That way you don't have to have the whole thing constructed at once. You can actually build pieces and parts. That would speed things up as well. So we've been looking into and already proposed courses of action that would move us from the study phase straight into the design build phase. And that would allow us to put things in place sooner. And that's one of the things that we are considering as we move into this next phase of the study.
I also do want to we were supposed to give a disclaimer too real quick, that the public comment period was actually officially over legally for what can be put into the administrative record and that process to make sure it's fair for what's included and considered. And again, we are looking at having a second administrative record period where we would take more comments, have more meetings again, but that official decision is that process right now for that public comment period is actually over. So although we're here, we're happy to talk and everything like that, this isn't part of the actual administrative record and any comments that are kind of collected as part of that. So we were told to give that disclaimer, just so you all know.
Just real quickly, there's nothing fast about these types of processes. On one hand, I'm not sure it should be that fast. I would say though, that if we insist on building structures that cost the amount of money that, for example, the coastal spine does, you have to have the federal government involved. There's no way you would do it without it. And I would say you could probably streamline things if you had less expensive alternatives and found the money locally to make these things happen.
What's the match percentage?
35.
So, in all seriousness, the federal share of this will be 65%. The local match needs to be 35%. So if you're talking about $32 billion, you'll need about $10 billion from the state of Texas to construct this. So I would contact your legislators and ask them to come up with $10 billion. The other thing would be the annual maintenance costs, which could be between $50 and $100 million. So annually, every year, $50 and $100 million. So we're going to have to come up with local taxes to support that. So, I mean, also contact your legislators and ask them how we will fund such a long-term commitment.
Okay, thank you. I did want to ask one thing. How many people here think they should have another public comment period? Majority of this. You're here? You're here?
We're trying.
And you too?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and then what will it take for the Corps of Engineers, SPEED Center, and the Texas A&M groups to come together and reach a consensus solution? Who wants to answer this?
We already started. So last month, we got together with each of the groups independently and spent an entire day at each of the stops along the way and we packed the rooms with scientists and engineers from all of the teams and shared information across the board with respect to everything from gate design to environmental impacts. And so we had physics folks in there, we had structural engineers in there, we had ecologists in there, and they all kind of formed independent groups and they're starting to communicate across the channels and share information because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to use each other's information as much as possible and then come to several consensuses about what should be done because there's lots of features that we are proposing to do. And so there is already move afoot to do that very thing.
Yeah, I would just second that. In my experience, I've been basically involved in these types of projects on the coast for 40 years. I've really never seen really the Corps at the point they are now being willing to sort of step back and take a hard look. I've litigated these things my whole career, so and it is, I think, a different process we're looking at now, and I think that, frankly, a lot of it has to do with the public. And the public was concerned about a lot of these issues and came forward and basically expressed concern, and I think it's caused an openness that, frankly, Bob, I'm not sure was there at the beginning. It's nice to see it. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see, would it help to restrict both residential and industrial development in harm's way? This would include buyouts and relocations such that over a 15 to 20 year period, buildings and plants would be reduced by 50%. Is this feasible? Anybody have a comment or answer on that? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not looking in the right direction.
Sure, I don't know if it's feasible or not, because we haven't discussed it. We haven't really discussed a widespread, large analysis of where planned withdrawal buyouts ought to be. Where are the most dangerous places for people to live, and what makes the most sense? What would it cost versus a big structure or something else? We haven't really had those conversations. And that's part of what the Sierra Club would like to see. You can make these things voluntary. People don't like them compulsory. But from the Sierra Club perspective, one of the things that needs to be done, right now FEMA is your avenue. But you have to wait such a long time if you decide that you want to leave to get your FEMA money that it puts you in a real bind. So somehow we need a mechanism, whether it's a local mechanism, state mechanism, whatever, that helps people get out immediately if that's what they want to do when they're in harm's way. And we don't have that right now, and you gotta wait till you get flooded and wait months and months and months. So I would suggest to you that that's something you could talk to your legislators about and your council members and people like that, because we need a mechanism so we can get people out when they've decided, I don't want this anymore.
Okay, thank you. The next one is for Dr. Burks-Copes. You're right here. Yeah, this one's out there in the future, I guess, considering our earlier discussions here. Who pays the about $130 million a year operations maintenance kind of bill for what I call the son of Ike Dyke?
Right, so I'm gonna call it the coastal barrier, because that's what we're trying to reinforce. So the Corps of Engineers pays 50% of the planning costs, and our cost share sponsor pays 50% of the planning, so the feasibility study part. Then when we go into design and into build, we have a new cost share sponsor, which has not been determined yet, that pays we pay 65% of federal government, and then the cost share sponsor pays 35%. When we get it all constructed and we're ready to turn over the keys, that goes to a new cost share sponsor. And those costs, those burdens of operations and maintenance are 100% shouldered by the cost share sponsor.
Which likely will be local government of some sort.
It can be, it can be a group of entities. For example, the ecosystem restoration also has to be managed, and operations and maintenance has to be done on those. And so it can be local entities that are cost share sponsoring that particular aspect. And so it could be kind of a group or collaboration of entities that would become the cost share sponsor for operation and maintenance into the long term.
One quick point too is that actually for the next 2 years of the study, starting in October, it's going to be 100% federally funded, even though we will continue to be the state sponsor, because the Texas delegates, and especially Senator Cornyn, so please thank them, got the federal government to pay for the last portion of the study.
100%.
100% federal, so the state no longer has to pay, but we will have to pay for 35%. Generally, that's normally how it ends up working through on operations, or 100% of operations and maintenance and 35% of the construction costs. But there are other alternatives that we have been looking at. The Corps has really been looking at this well. There's public-private partnerships that could work into this. There's reductions in insurance that could possibly flow in and be put into trust funds that could allow for some of the construction costs. There could be different other avenues that could go instead of just basic taxation or creating different funding sources that would be able to pay for this potentially besides just traditional ways of doing it. So.
But I think too, for this question, it's important to recognize that I think it's great, that we were able to get the feasibility study shouldered off of Texas and put more on the federal side. But the operation and maintenance costs, which is what will be the long term, the 50 years that we have this, 50 years plus, for the operation and maintenance every year will cost between $50 and $100 million based on the cost of this project, because industry standard is around 2 to 3% of the construction costs for operation and maintenance. And so it's really important to remember that as we're considering this project, that will be on the tax base. It will be property owners, it will be folks here in Galveston County, Harris County, those living in the cities. In Louisiana, they actually had a really hard time. One of the big flood wall and flood barrier systems that were set up in St. Bernard Parish, for over a year, the parish commission, no one voted to actually fund the operation and maintenance costs for that particular infrastructure. And so that's a really big concern on if the tax base can't afford to provide the maintenance for these types of systems, because if they don't work, what good are they going to do for us?
And I talked about this earlier, and I didn't mean to be flippant about it. I do really think the hardest part is going to be coming up with a local match. So I think getting that money from the state of Texas, getting that money from whatever new authority is put together, whether it's a 4-county or a 6-county region, that's gonna be the hard part. I think the easy part is getting the federal dollars. I think the hard part is getting the state match, and then whatever the maintenance is long term.
Yeah, and this reminds me too of over the last year and a half or so, following all the activities with Harvey and what the Harris County did to get a bond issue of $2.5 billion, and people that say, and somebody here may correct me, but I believe that it'd be about another $28 billion to take care of Harris County. I always hoped that the state would provide some rainy day funds for that, but that doesn't appear to be happening. Is it possible that that would happen for the money needed for the coastal barrier?
So there is a bill. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. So Senator Larson has filed a bill to take up to $3 billion, I think, out of the rainy day fund to use for flood infrastructure costs. But that's across the whole state. So that's not. It doesn't mean that our area gets, the vast majority of it. So I mean, again, there's theoretically money out there at the state level, but there's going to need to be a lot more state money to fund this whole thing, and it's over time, right? So the time frame I've heard is that the earliest it could be potentially funded would be 2023, and then the earliest construction could start was 2025, with a 10-year construction time frame. So the earliest it could finish is 2035, and it would need money essentially year after year after year, unless it was all authorized up front, which it wouldn't be. So it's a long process. There is time to come up with a local match, but again, this thing, one of our concerns as Galveston Bay Foundation, and Jim has talked about it, is we design something that's so massive it never gets funded, because we want to have something that protects everyone, rather than having a smaller structure that might protect, some portion of industry or some portion of the people around here that can be funded, right? So it's a balancing act, and I hear Kelly talk about it too. That's why they would need to fund it and build it in phases, which would potentially lengthen the construction schedule. So again, I started my comments when I first talked tonight about this being a really difficult public policy issue, and there's so many ways to look at it. But the idea that we should build it yesterday and be done with it is simply simplistic, because there's no way to design, construct, and fund such a structure in a short period of time. I think it's going probably as fast as it could possibly go.
Anybody else here? Okay, I tell you, we got at least 3 questions about industry. And let's see, how many dollars will the ship channel industries contribute to the cost of protection? How is industry planning to mitigate their catastrophic impact in this area in the event of a worst-case hurricane? And we need industry inputs, its economic and labor impacts in this equation. Has this been addressed? Anybody willing to step up to this one?
Industry is very shy and very reluctant when it comes to, one, admitting that they have a problem, and 2, being willing to step forward and make a funding alternative. I think to the extent that, one, someone thinks that industry on their own will take adequate action, I personally do not think that's going to happen. I think that, I have presented our computer modeling. I think the response is we've never seen anything higher than 13 to 14 feet up the ship channel. It's relatively well protected to that height. I think that our current thinking, the way we discuss climate change in this area, the way that we talk honestly or not honestly about the types of storms that we're going to see, I think has led to a feeling that the status quo is acceptable. I don't think that's the situation, but I think that we generally have set up if you will, an environment in this community that allows industry just not to face, I think, the realities that they're looking at. I do think there's ways that we can put this together. I think there's ways to patch a funding concept together that industry will participate in, and I think it'll be necessary before this is over for industry to be a participant if they're going to be a beneficiary. And frankly, I think they have to be a beneficiary.
I want to add just one thing really quick.
I think it may be a misnomer or a mistake to focus specifically on the footprint of the industrial complex. People do not live at those power plants or at those petrochemical plants. They live in the region. And when a storm hits and their children can't get to school, they will stay home. And so part of protecting this area and reducing the risks is to protect and reduce the risks for the entire region, not just the industrial plants. And so don't just think that they can raise the walls around those plants and call it good. They still won't go to work if their kids can't get to school. So we have to think about it in a more holistic approach and not just require them to raise their walls.
So, think about it in a different way. Our position, of course, is that part of our position is that even if this thing had full speed ahead, it's not going to be constructed for another 17 or 18 years. So, regardless of whether or not the coastal barrier moves forward or not, industry should ensure that everybody's got a hurricane plan. And I think the big facilities out there absolutely have hurricane plans, right? So, all the big guys recognize their risk and they have very set things they do when a storm's on the way. If we get that killer storm, even if we have the coastal barrier, there's still going to be damage. But I think the problem in my mind is the sort of smaller guys out there. What happened in Harvey was that Arkema plant. You all know the story about Arkema, right? So, that was just totally extreme. They clearly didn't have a hurricane plan. They didn't do anything they should have done in the storm, and it created a massive problem. And that's the fear, is that not, the majority of the plants I think are going to be good in a good hurricane, or a decent sized hurricane. It's just the outliers that are going to cause our problems. So it's not, I don't think the sky is falling in terms of industry, in terms of their protection. They've got lots of different plans that they can implement, but it's the small guys or the outliers, and they will present a lot of problems. So, I don't know how to get around that other than we should be emphasizing over and over again that every plant needs a real hurricane plan so that when a storm is coming, they can do the best they can right now. And I will also say this, and I can go on, I got lots of thoughts on this, but years back, legally speaking, from a liability standpoint, big storm comes and you could argue with a straight face in some cases that it was an act of God, like we couldn't do anything about it. I think everybody here locally is on notice that we're going to get bigger and bigger storms, and there's not going to be any defense to that liability by saying it's an act of God. So I know the plants are also thinking about that and looking at increasing their own protection. So I think some of this stuff is going on, but again, I agree with Jim. We're never going to get every single plant protected in the maximum way on their own unless we make it happen.
All right, thank you. And I'll add to that during Harvey, the biggest and worst pollution came from two petrochemical plants on the ship channel owned by Magellan Midstream. And so it's right there. Okay, here's a question. If a bridge could not be built from Galveston to Boulevard in the past due to unstable sand bottom, how can the gates be stabilized?
So the reason that we still have work to do is these types of questions. We have a series of geological, geomorphological surveys that still remain to be done, and those are the kinds of things that we do in the design build phase. So we can't necessarily answer right now what the substrate is down below. We know there have been some, Fergo, for example, has done corings, they call them borings sometimes, of the channel, so we know some information about the channel, but at this point we don't know whether the substrate is or what it is completely composite made of. So we do have plans for surveys in the near future to start getting that kind of information, and then that informs the gate design and the gate structures.
And GCC already has done some initial work on that already and has provided that to us.
That's the acronym.
Oh, Gulf Coast Community Protection and Restoration District, the Recovery District. They were the group again that was set up by the Governor Perry following 6 county judges that were doing a lot of the work. Dana Baum Engineers and primary contractor. They have Chris Lease, who was here, former colonel, head of the district.
He left.
So he was here earlier.
Alright.
But they've been doing great work on doing research on this as well. And they have done a little bit of the boring and soil sampling. There has been a little bit, there's a lot of opportunity here for doing nature-based projects like we've been discussing. We are definitely looking into all the issues that have been discussed here, and I totally agree with everything that's been said. And one of those is actually potentially building a bridge over Bolivar to Galveston. So there has been a little bit of initial discussion on that, and could these sluice gates or whatever they end up being be used as a bridge that could then allow for traffic to flow over to Galveston and Bolivar. But those are really initial and just sort of some base discussion. So I don't think that that's completely impossible, and there will be discussion looking into that.
Just a couple more questions. Let's see. Is the Mid-Bay Park going to be made from dredge material piled up and parallel to the shore?
Yeah, the plan is to take dredge material to dewater it, and currently there are 25-foot levees along the disposal dikes that exist in the upper ship channel. Those were formed as part of the dredging process, so we think you have a wonderful chance for kind of double use of funding. If you've got a dredging project that's going to be going on, perhaps you can just go ahead and assemble the material for building the levee. It will be parallel to the coastline. Most of it will be on the east side of the channel, just the lower portion would be on the west side.
All right, thank you. And let's see. If a hurricane comes up Galveston Bay, will the barrier system retain floodwaters, that is, slow down drainage from the large rain systems like Harvey?
I'll do it first with mine.
Yeah, you can do it with yours and then we can talk first. That's fine.
The people I work with at SPEED Center are also hydrologic modelers. They basically do rainfall runoff modeling, as when the hurricane surge modeling really comes from the University of Texas. Dr. Clint Dawson is the expert there, and the guys I work with are learning a lot about that, but their real expertise is inland flooding and riverine flooding. The thing that is probably the best news on that is that there's a time lag between the rainfall runoff, particularly on the bigger river systems like the San Jacinto, coming to flood stage and basically the decline of the surge level. So we anticipate that the surge gates will be open, the water will be basically moving out of the bay probably 24 hours before the major flood flow comes down into the bay system. Along those lines, I'm probably more concerned about trees and debris that would be coming down with the flood waters, probably more so than I would be concerned actually about evacuation of the waters at this point in time.
And with the coastal barrier plan, there are two gates proposed, one at Clear Creek and one at Dickinson. Adjacent to those are pumps so that we can, if the gates are closed, draw off the water that's coming down and put it into the bay while the gates are closed, and then they will be open. So the storm's coming, the surge is pushing up, you close the gates, start pumping, and then you open the gates up and you continue to pump so that you don't have induced flooding behind.
Okay, and a question here for Galveston Bay Foundation. I cannot see only a 27% restriction. More likely it must be 50%, even taking into account the varying depth across the outlets. Do you have anything on that?
So, you look at it and you wonder, right? So I'm going to take the Corps at their word, I'm going to take their engineers at their word now, but I will also say, somebody just asked the question, I think the engineering of that flood structure across that pass is going to have to be the newest, strongest thing in the world. Like, I'm not joking. There's never been anything constructed. So I personally am not convinced, but I'll believe the engineers, that it can even be done. So I think there's a lot of study. Somebody's going to think they can do it, but it's a massive project, and I've heard the Colonel talk about this being the largest engineering project in the world in the 21st century. And so we are going to be ground zero to test the thing out potentially. And But don't underestimate how big this is. It takes 10 years to construct. Think about all the construction traffic on the island and on Bolivar and around the pass for 10 years. I'm sort of editorializing now, so I'll stop.
So it can't fail, right?
It can't fail.
Okay, that's the bottom line. It can't fail. Don't let it fail.
So there was, that was one of the biggest comments, is the restriction. And so that's a very prime point that we were looking at over the next 2 years of finding ways to reduce the restriction. 27% is what the modeling is showing right now. There's different ways that we were looking at on basically structuring how its faces, whether it can be sort of concave and increase the size essentially of the gate system, so that there would be less restriction overall, and then also the actual design of the gates themselves. So the biggest real issue with the restrictions is the islands that need to be built for these Mazatlan style gates. Is there another way to do it? Like, could you do it similar to how the Thames barrier system is built in London, where the gates flip up? There's very little restriction at all with those gates. The new gates that are put in Venice have basically zero restriction level because they just flip straight up as basically big barges that flip up. Both of those environments are different than Galveston Bay, so the design of that is different, but it's things that we're looking at and things that we're engaging very closely with the international community, the few engineering firms that know how to design these type of gates, and so those questions are going to be answered. We are pretty confident that we can come up with solutions that will decrease that so that there will be very little restriction of water flow, and that there will not be an issue with basically salinity levels changing. And then a really big point to make is that with the decreased freshwater inflows that we're likely going to be seeing over time, could this potentially be a benefit? And that's what we've seen in the Thames system, is that they're using it for different reasons than they initially did. And if there isn't as much freshwater inflow into it, could this actually be a benefit in some ways? It's not something that we can really look at as part of this study, but it is something that could potentially end up being a positive for the overall Galveston Bay system because of these overall other negative effects that are occurring to the bay itself.
So I'll add two more out-of-the-box ideas that have already been proposed. Some students at Texas A&M took field trips over to the Netherlands this last year and came back with an accordion-style design that stays on shore and is only drawn out when it's needed, and then it's pushed back on shore when it's not needed. There is a proposed design of a pop-up gate that stays embedded in the substrate and only comes up when needed, and then it drops back down and there's zero constriction. The engineers are also considering something that's like a Charlie Brown design. If you think of his shirt that has the zigzag in it, the more cross-sectional decrease, the less constriction. So if they pivot those gates more horizontally or more vertically and they run it in a zigzag, then it's less constriction. So they're thinking way out of the box, and they're not doing it alone. They're bringing in international scientists in the next month to throw these ideas at them and to ask them what they think and to get the lessons learned, because there's no sense in us trying to come up with this in a vacuum. And there are people out there that have done this, and they have been operating the Thames gates for over 50 years now, and so they know what to expect, and they have a series in their pocket of lessons learned that they never anticipated that they have had to overcome, including having to close the gate for the Queen's birthday. So this is the kind of thing they never anticipated when they built that gate. So they are coming, and we intend to use and drain their brain power and completely pull everything out of them that we can. And then when they go home, we will still be communicating with them. There is a group called iStorm, which is an international storm barriers group that we belong to, and we have conversations with them on a monthly basis at this point, working through some of these strategies and the problems that we're encountering and foreseeing.
Very good. That reminds me, NASA has done all kinds of innovative ways to go in and do outreach for new ideas going back even 30 years for different ways, different types of vehicles and so on to go to Mars even. And a lot of times those youngsters, those young people can come up with some really neat ideas that people that have been in the business for 30 years just would never think of. That's just the reality. Okay, somebody asked, would Galveston Bay Foundation put their slide presentation on their website? I think it probably is.
Yeah, I think we can do that.
Related to that, we will put up all of these presentations on a website. I just have to make sure that Americans United in Action, who we have volunteers that say we'll do it there, as we did a year and a half ago. And also I'll talk to the University of Houston Clear Lake Environmental Institute of Houston, where the first flood forum is on their website still, so we'll get this up there. One last question is, okay, we've had all kinds of rich discussion here, and a lot of good ideas, a lot of good thoughts. What can we do with them? Can we send them to you?
Absolutely.
Where do we send them?
So in one of the slideshows, it talked about the website.
My slideshows, there was another slideshow also that had the website, COASTALSTUDY.TEXAS.GOV. When you go there, there is an email box where you can submit comments still. We can't incorporate them into the administrative record at this point, but that's not to say that we will ignore them. There's also, in one of the slides, I think that Bob might have shown, I'm not sure. Somebody gave Jennifer Morgan's mail address. She's our environmental lead, and she will also accept them in her mailbox, in her snail mail.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we're going to wrap it up now, and I wanted to thank again Commissioner Adrian Garcia and his team. They helped us get this facility. You'd be surprised if you're a grassroots group how expensive it is just to get a facility like this. We were able to get things at a reduced rate. We appreciate that. We appreciate his people. James is back there that helped set up the chairs and all this, and air conditioning and fans and so on. Jason Kamelski, Teresa Kamelski, Peter Brown, Linda King, Michael Newton, Kevin Beard, Jackson Gluck, Doreen Nelson, and Martha Bishop and Edith Santa Maria were all volunteers that were here tonight and have helped put this together. I want to thank them especially. I want to thank the organizations that have been involved, all of them, and I want to thank especially the speakers for coming and providing such solid responses for really good questions and interacting with the public. I do believe, and I see this everywhere, we need a lot of transparency and we need a lot more public engagement. Part of it is figuring out, I think Jordan might have said something along this line, of how to engage people and how to motivate them to get involved. That's so much easier to sit at home and watch TV. It's a little bit different to come out on a dreary night and participate in civics. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for coming. And one last thing.
How about a thanks to Doug for
I don't know why I do this.
Yeah, well, I do want to say thanks to the Corps and the JLL. I mean, they have a lot of these that they got us to do. They're working hard on this. You know, we may not always see eye to eye, but they're doing a really important job, and we do appreciate what you do. So
Thank you, and we'll let y'all go at this point, and please pay attention. We'll be sending out emails and Facebook